The Bones on the Roof, The Unresolved Death of Gary Lee White, Sin in the Bible Belt. In September of 2019, skeletal human remains were discovered on the roof of an abandoned building in Biloxi, Mississippi. The location alone raised immediate questions. Bodies are commonly found in wooded areas, waterways, abandoned interiors, or shallow graves. A rooftop, however, is different. It is elevated, isolated, rarely accessed. It is not a place someone reaches by accident without deliberate action or extraordinary circumstances. At the time of discovery, investigators were unable to identify the remains. There was no immediate match to any active missing person case in the region. Early statements from law enforcement indicated that foul play was not initially suspected, though officials stressed that final conclusions would depend on forensic examination. The case was entered into national databases as an unidentified person and became known publicly as Biloxi John Doe. For several years, the remains remained unidentified. Then, through advances in forensic genealogy and collaborative investigative efforts, the skeleton was finally given a name. Gary Lee White. White was originally from Jackson, Mississippi. The identification restored his identity, but it did not restore his story. It did not explain how he came to be on that rooftop, how long he had been there, or what caused his death. One question was answered. Many more were open. The publicly confirmed facts in this case are limited. The remains were found on a rooftop in Biloxi in September 2019 on a building that had been abandoned for an extended period of time. The skeletal condition indicated prolonged exposure to the elements. Law enforcement did not publicly report signs of obvious trauma or violence, and no official cause or manner of death has been released. Beyond these points, little has been confirmed. The location itself remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case. A rooftop is not a place where people commonly end up without intention or assistance. It suggests several possibilities, and each possibility leads to a very different interpretation of events. And yet none can be confirmed. For many families, identification brings closure. In this case, it brought recognition without resolution. There's been no publicly reconstructed timeline explaining when White left Jackson, why he traveled to Biloxi, or how long he had been missing before the remains were discovered. There is also no public explanation for why no missing person match was made earlier, raising questions about reporting gaps, systemic failures, or lost connections. Because official information remains limited, multiple theories have emerged. Theory 1. The Hurricane Katrina. One of the most persistent theories surrounding the Biloxi John Doe case is that the remains may date back to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. While no forensic evidence has confirmed a connection to the storm, the conditions Katrina created make this scenario physically possible. Hurricane Katrina did not simply flood Biloxi. It produced storm surges exceeding 20 feet in some areas, turning neighborhoods into fast-moving rivers of debris. Vehicles, building materials, and household contents swept together in chaotic currents. In those conditions, bodies would not behave as they do in calm water. They could be lifted, pushed, rotated, pinned, and carried long distances without predictable direction. In this scenario, the body could have been transported inland by the surge, either floating freely or entangled in debris such as lumber, fencing, roofing materials, or even a tarp. As water levels rose, repeated surges could have pressed the body against the side of a building, gradually forcing it higher. Buildings do not repel floodwater. They redirect it. Corners, ledges, and structural features create swirling eddies that trap objects in place. Over time, and with enough force, the body could have been pushed onto a roof surface rather than falling back to the ground. Once deposited, the roof itself could have acted as a partial container. Roof corners, parapet walls, drainage channels, and rooftop equipment often create sheltered zones with reduced wind exposure. If the body came to rest in such a space, it may not have been subjected to enough force to scatter widely. The absence of clothing or personal belongings does not disprove this scenario. During violent water transport, clothing can be torn away by debris, suction, and impact. Shoes frequently separate from bodies even in calm drownings. Wallets, phones, and jewelry could easily be lost early in the process. A body carried through storm debris would likely arrive stripped of most personal effects. The presence of a tarp nearby may also support this theory. It could have been part of the debris field that initially trapped or partially covered the body. Over time, lighter debris and vegetation may have dried, decayed, or blown away, while heavier remains stayed closer to the original resting position. As decomposition occurred, scavengers and environmental exposure would gradually alter the scene. However, scavenging does not always result in wide scatter. Heavier bones can remain relatively close together, especially when partially protected by roof texture, gravel, tar, or structural barriers. Wind alone is rarely strong enough to move adult human bones significant distances unless the surface is smooth and unobstructed. The long dark streak visible in aerial imagery has fueled speculation, but it may simply be a drainage path where rainwater carries dirt, algae, or debris. Such staining is common on roofs and cannot be interpreted as evidence without physical testing. One of the strongest supporting points for this theory is the discovery location itself, the southwest corner of the roof, a position consistent with how debris often accumulates during storm-driven water movement. The fact that a maintenance worker, rather than the public, ultimately discovered the remains also supports the idea that the roof was rarely accessed. Still, significant uncertainties remain. If the remains truly dated back to 2005, investigators might expect additional forensic indicators of extreme age beyond skeletal positioning alone. The lack of publicly available forensic detail makes it impossible to confirm or reject the timeline. There is also the question of building height relative to storm surge levels. Without those measurements, it remains unclear whether water could realistically have deposited remains at that elevation. While the hurricane scenario explains many elements, it does not explain everything. If this was not a hurricane deposition, then how did a human skeleton come to rest on the roof of an abandoned building in Biloxi, unnoticed for years? And if it was the hurricane, was this man one of Katrina's forgotten dead, or did the storm only hide a death that had already occurred? Theory 2, the foul play theory. Another possibility is that the remains did not arrive on the roof by accident at all, but were placed there deliberately. In this scenario, the rooftop is not the endpoint of movement. It is a concealment location. The building was abandoned, rarely accessed, and elevated above normal pedestrian sightlines. A roof offers isolation, invisibility from street level, and protection from casual discovery. For someone attempting to hide a body, it would be an effective and unusually successful choice. The lack of clothing and personal belongings may support this theory. Clothing could have been removed to hinder identification. Personal property may have been taken intentionally or discarded elsewhere. The presence of a tarp nearby could indicate an attempt to wrap, transport, or temporarily conceal the body. The skeleton's relatively contained positioning also aligns with deliberate placement. A body left intentionally tends to remain more localized than one deposited by uncontrolled forces. Scavenging and weather may still alter the remains, but the general grouping often persists. There is also the matter of access. Someone familiar with the building could have known how to reach the roof safely. Maintenance workers, contractors, trespassers, or individuals using the structure for shelter or illicit activity may have had repeated access without drawing attention. If the person responsible was local, they may have known the building would not be inspected for years. This theory explains several elements at once: the rooftop placement as intentional, the absence of clothing and property, the lack of wide bone scatter, the tarp as a transport or concealment tool, and the prolonged concealment without discovery. But it cannot be proven. There is no witness testimony, no publicly released forensic trauma detail, no suspect, and no confirmed timeline. Without those elements, foul play remains a theory, not a conclusion. And if someone placed the body there, who were they hiding it from? And why did no one ever come back for it? Theory 3, the self-harm theory. Because so little is publicly known about Gary Lee White's life before his death, some have questioned whether his presence on the rooftop could be connected to self-harm. The isolation of the location, combined with the absence of witnesses or personal belongings, has led some to wonder whether he may have gone there intentionally. However, there is no verified public evidence that White struggled with depression, mental illness, or suicidal thoughts. No medical history, personal records, family statements, or investigative reports have been released to support that conclusion. His personal background remains almost entirely unknown. Without that context, any suggestion of self-harm rests on speculation about the location alone, not on documented behavior or expressed intent. Reaching the roof would have required deliberate effort and access, yet there is no evidence showing how or when he climbed there. There were no personal items, notes, or objects left behind that might suggest purpose or planning. Because the cause of death could not be determined, investigators have never classified his death as a suicide. The self-harm theory exists only because of missing information, not because of supporting evidence. Theory 4. The accidental death theory. The final main theory involves the possibility that Gary Lee White's death was the result of an accident. The building was abandoned, unsecured, and deteriorating. Falls, collapses, and missteps are common hazards in environments like this. White may have climbed onto the roof seeking shelter, privacy, or simple exploration, and then suffered a fatal injury caused by a fall, illness, dehydration, or exhaustion. Because his remains were skeletal, medical examiners could not determine whether he died from blunt trauma, internal injury, exposure, or another cause. Any injuries that might have explained an accident would have been impossible to confirm years later. This theory accounts for the absence of obvious violence, but it struggles to explain the rooftop placement, the lack of personal belongings, and the fact that the remains went undiscovered for so long. Like the others, it remains possible, but unproven, and ending without answers. Despite the restoration of his identity, the central questions remain unanswered. Why was Gary Lee White in Biloxi? How did he reach the rooftop? How long had he been there before discovery? What caused his death? Why was his disappearance never connected to missing person records? Did anyone know he was missing at all? Gary Lee White is no longer anonymous, but the story of his final days remains incomplete. His case stands as a reminder that identification does not always bring closure. Sometimes it only confirms how much remains unknown.